Come in. What's up, Rumi?
Dude, you will not believe what acting gig I just got. I got a role in a new Quentin Fleck movie.
No way. The new Quentin Fleck movie? Okay, dude, that's dope.
Yeah, man, apparently this film is going to be about the community that Quentin grew up in. Honestly, it's quite interesting. You want to take a look?
I mean, it's a personal document. I don't really think I should look into it. You know, it's your job. I don't want you to lose your job. Okay, fine. Jeez. Give me the goddamn script. Starring Sean Holland as a white man who moves into a diverse neighborhood. Okay, cool. Stars various people of color, and that's pretty progressive, yeah. Wait.
You got a problem with the script, or?
Yeah, all the characters on this page are black, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm kind of confused as to why a majority of their vocabulary consists of the N-word.
Because it's a black neighborhood. Of course they're gonna use the N-word.
Like, literally every line in the script uses the N-word at least twice. Dude, what is this movie?
I mean, Quentin did say it was supposed to be an accurate representation of his neighborhood.
Yeah, I know it's supposed to be a depiction of Quentin's neighborhood, but seriously, this kind of feels a bit offensive.
Do you have something against his neighborhood, or?
Dude, no, that's not my point, Rumi. Look, Quentin Fleck is a white director, right? So, are you sure that the use of the N-word in this script represents the community that he grew up in, or... Like, it kind of looks like he's just using his community as an excuse to use the N-word. I don't know if you understand the situation, man. Dude, I think you have a lot to learn about representation in film before you get into whatever this project is.
Wait. Let me guess. You're going to create an entire video essay that talks about this topic, just so that you can teach me about stereotypes in film.
Not just film, pop culture.
As American writer John Podhoretz once said, pop culture is a reflection of social change, not a cause of social change. Any art form can serve as a medium used to express one's beliefs and perception of life. Popular culture is a testament to this statement, as many films, TV shows, music, and other forms of popular entertainment have been used to showcase how our society has evolved over time. One of the most important key elements in presenting society through a pop culture lens is to represent the people and communities that live within it. Of course, nowadays, the films and TV shows that we watch and enjoy reflect the progressive and welcoming society that we currently live in. But I think people tend to forget that representation in pop culture wasn't always this perfect. In many cases, it's still imperfect up until today. So with that being said, I would like to take this time to tackle the history of representation in pop culture, what this representation has done right, and what it can still improve on. I will also be discussing how historical events and social issues throughout the years may have directly or indirectly caused or have been caused by misrepresentation. Now, before we begin, I would like to say that this video will be separated into 3 different parts, each part representing a different community or communities. Of course, anyone can be misrepresented in pop culture, but I believe these 3 communities in particular are the ones that are misrepresented the most. And since we just got a glimpse at my roommate's racially stereotypical script, it's only appropriate for us to start with... Yeah, I think we can all agree that people of color struggle the most in America. I mean, our entire country was quite literally built with one type of person in mind. Straight, white, male. That white part especially. So when Africans were brought to this country against their will, they weren't seen as human beings all because they weren't white. Rather, they were seen as animals, beasts, slaves. By the time slavery was abolished in 1865, It was already too late. The animalistic stereotype had already been ingrained into people's minds, and eventually it was reflected onto the pop culture of that time. Most notably through a practice called blackface. Blackface performances involved white actors applying black makeup on their face and sometimes on their entire body, and painting big red lips on their mouths. These performers would reference the animalistic and criminal stereotype of African Americans when portraying their black characters. One of the most popular blackface performances of the time was Thomas D. Rice's portrayal of the character Jim Crow. These racist depictions of black people showed how widespread these misconceptions about the black community had become, and they were made even worse by the fact that these false black narratives were written and acted out by white people. Eventually, as the practice of blackface became more present in media, people began to confuse these false depictions for reality. Specifically, the use of blackface in the 1950 blockbuster The Birth of a Nation played a significant role in influencing and encouraging further discrimination towards black people in this country. The power of pop culture, woo! Now, of course, we all know the civil rights narrative. As years go by, more and more black people start to have their voices heard, and black people were given more opportunities to voice out their opinion. Now, how about let's flash forward to a much more nostalgic time in pop culture history. The 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Of course, this time period was best known for the prevalence of television. Coincidentally, by the time television became more mainstream, it had already been about a decade since some of the most important civil rights acts were established in our society. So, in an era where African Americans were given more rights and opportunities, it was inevitable that black storytellers would use these privileges and new entertainment medium to finally tell authentic black stories that they've always strived for. Shows such as The Jeffersons, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Cosby Show. Those three shows were known for bringing to light black narratives and social issues of the time. People of color finally had stories and characters that they could relate to, and everything seemed fine, right? Right? Well, there was one slight problem. Let's take another look at those shows that I mentioned earlier. The Jeffersons, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, The Cosby Show. What do all those shows have in common? They're all sitcoms. Of course, there's nothing wrong with a little comedy. Many people use comedy to cope with situations and reflect on social issues. And like I said, these sitcoms defined multiple generations and an entire culture. But sometimes the funniest moments of a sitcom can ultimately undermine the importance of more meaningful moments. For example, let's take a look at Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. The main character, Will, grew up without a father, which, side note, that fatherless black character ended up becoming a new black stereotype itself because of how common the story trope had become in black stories at the time. Anyways, later on in the story, Will ends up meeting his father for the first time, and it is thought that Will finally had a chance to bond with the dad he never grew up with. But unfortunately, by the end of the episode, Will's dad ends up leaving him again, and it leads to arguably one of the most emotional moments in the series.
I'm sorry. If there was something that I
Hey,
could
you know what? You ain't got to do nothing, Uncle Phil. Hey, ain't like I'm still 5 years old, Ain't like I'm gonna be sitting up every night asking my mom, when's Daddy coming home, Who needs him? Hey, he wasn't there to teach me how to shoot my first basket, but I learned, didn't I? Hey, I got pretty damn good at it too, didn't I, Uncle Phil?
You did.
Got through my first day without him, right? I learned how to drive. I learned how to shave. I learned how to fight without him. I had 14 great birthdays without him. He never even sent me a damn card. To hell with him! How come you don't want me, man?
Wow. Not only did the scene bring awareness to the emotional damage that an individual can obtain as a result of a parentless childhood, but Will Smith's acting perfectly captured his character's heartbreak over the situation. This is a black character that was not being portrayed as an animal, but rather a human being that all audiences can sympathize with. It truly reflects how progressive society has become when it comes to recognizing the struggles of Black lives. Too bad it was overshadowed by the Carlton dance.
It's not unusual to be lonely. It's not unusual to have fun with anyone. But when I see you hanging about with anyone, it's not unusual to see me cry. I wanna die.
You see the problem? There's a huge difference between audiences simply learning about the social issues and audiences actually recognizing the seriousness of the issues. So when you have moments like the Carlton dance, it can lead to audiences assuming that people of color are living a happy-go-lucky life. But in reality, racial discrimination, police brutality, gang violence, Black lives at the time were anything but happy and go lucky. I'd say a current example of this scenario can be seen in modern day internet culture. Specifically in the mid-2010s during the rise of the video sharing app known as Vine. A moment of silence for Vine, by the way. Alright, anyways, through Vine, a lot of today's internet influencers, most notably Black creators, were able to establish their fame in 6 seconds or less. In fact, some of the most memorable Vines were created by people of color. Allow me to show you some of my personal favorites.
White people be like,
Billy, where are you, Billy? Is that you?
Black people be like,
Forget Billy, Billy's dead!
This is the most beautiful day! They got helmets on their heads, but I gotta want them alone instead! Oh, we ain't singing shit!
Funny, right? Well, once again, I feel like this was another era in pop culture history where race-related social issues were being completely undermined by the comedic ways people of color were portrayed in the media. I mean, these three Vines in particular quite literally showcase three modern-day Black stereotypes. Black people loving shoes, Black people loving watermelon, Black people being scared of the woods. Kinda strange how we sort of just embrace these as our favorite Vines, despite them being filled with a bunch of stereotypes. It's worth mentioning that around the same time Vine became popular, the Black Lives Matter movements began to gain traction in 2013 after the death of Trayvon Martin. So with these two events coinciding with each other, I wouldn't be surprised if Black Vine culture ended up overshadowing the BLM movements for a small period of time, similar to how the Carlton dance overshadowed Will's emotional moments. Overall, I think it's safe to say that a majority of Black representation in pop culture has involved both the breaking of stereotypes and the unintentional creation of new stereotypes. Nonetheless, I'm at least glad that nowadays African American storytellers have a number of art mediums that they can use to visually represent or reflect on their experiences.
Who are you? Say your name.
Yeah, this album is dedicated to all the teachers that told me I never amount to nothing. To all the people that lived above the buildings that I was hustling from that called the police on me when I was just trying to make some money to feed my daughter. Yeah. And to all my peoples in the struggle, you know what I'm saying? It's all good, baby. Shake it. It was all a dream. I used to read Word Up magazine. Salt-N-Pepa and Heavy D up in the limousine. Hanging pictures on my wall. Every Saturday, rap attack Mr. Magic Marley Marl. I let my tape rock till my tape pop. Smoking weed and bamboo, sipping on private stock. Way back when I had the red and black lumberjack with the hat to match. Remember rapping Duke? The hard. You never thought that hip hop would take it this far. Now I'm in the limelight cause I rhyme tight. Time to get paid, blow up like the world trade. Born sinner, the opposite of a winner. Remember when I used to eat sardines for dinner? Peace to Ron G, Brucey B, Kid Capri, Funk Master Flex, Love Bug, Star Ski. I'm blowing up like you thought I would. Call a crib, same number, same hood. It's all good. And if you don't know, now you know.
Now, before we continue on to the next category, I would like to take a quick intermission from our main discussion and talk about some of the other ways people of color have been represented and misrepresented in pop culture. I mostly talked about the history of African American representation, but I would also like to talk about some of the other people of color, specifically Asian community and the Spanish and Latinx community. And since I'm going to try to make this brief and quick, it's only appropriate to start off by talking about my good old friend, Speedy Gonzales. Did you know that there was a brief moment in time when Cartoon Network banned Speedy Gonzales cartoons? The reasons were quite understandable, as not only was Speedy originally voiced by Mel Blanc, a white voice actor doing a stereotypical Mexican voice, but Speedy himself just no longer reflected the values of Warner Brothers at the time. But in a surprising twist, Cartoon Network received an overwhelming amount of letters from Spanish fans of Speedy, saying that Speedy was a proto-Zapatista who fought against American imperialism before it was cool to do so. Which, now that I think about it, one of Speedy's longtime enemies, Sylvester the Cat, can be seen as a metaphor for white people chasing minorities out of their native lands. Shout out to Looney Tunes for being ahead of their time. This ultimately became one of the few examples of how a character's stereotype was the reason why people loved him. And instead of getting rid of the character altogether, they simply just decided to alter him to better reflect that meaningful representation. In the recently released Space Jam: A New Legacy, comedian Gabriel Iglesias, aka Fluffy, was given the role of Speedy, which helped make the character more authentic in terms of the community that he represents. As Gabriel Iglesias stated on his Twitter, "You can't catch me, cancel culture. I'm the fastest mouse in all of Mexico." Following up, here's a not so fun fact. Whitewashing in pop culture. Whitewashing is basically the practice of Hollywood taking stories about people of color and contextualizing them through a white narrative-driven lens. Unfortunately, the Asian community has suffered the most from whitewashing, as Hollywood has had a history of taking Asian-driven narratives and entertainment mediums, such as anime, and completely whitewashing them. For example, there's Nat Wolff's portrayal of the character Light Yagami in Netflix's Death Note movie, and there's Scarlett Johansson's portrayal of Major Motoko Kusanagi from Ghost in the Shell, both of which were originally Japanese characters. And of course, because of this whitewashing backlash, both movies ended up getting poor reviews, which, yeah, they weren't really good movies to begin with, so deserved. Like, Hollywood, you literally have a bunch of talented Asian performers, and you decide to go with the most basic white bitches. What is that logic? Oh yeah, and don't even get me started on M. Night Shyamalan's The Last Airbender movie. The original Avatar: The Last Airbender cartoon was meant to be a meaningful homage to Asian culture. So why would you cast non-Asian actors as characters who were originally Asian? There is no movie in Ba Sing Se. Oh yeah, and one last thing before we move on. Forced representation, also known as the practice of including a character of color in a narrative just for the sake of diversity. Usually, forced representation doesn't bring awareness to social problems within a community, and mostly just relies on stereotypes to define a character. For example, Baljeet from Phineas and Ferb. He was the stereotypical Indian character who was the nerd of Phineas and Ferb's friend group. Now, I will give Disney props. There are some times in the show when Baljeet would reference Bollywood and other aspects of Indian culture, but then you have smaller aspects of the character, such as how his favorite flavor of Jell-O is curry, or how his number one fear in life is failing a math test. Yeah, some of these jokes didn't age well. There's also Apu from The Simpsons, who was the stereotypical market employee that most Indians were depicted as in pop culture. He was voiced by Hank Azaria, who's another white actor who used the stereotypical voice to portray a character of color. Now, considering the fact that India has their own medium of pop culture, the previously mentioned Bollywood, I can understand why Indian individuals would take their portrayals in pop culture a lot more seriously than other communities. While communities such as the Spanish community appreciate any sort of representation regardless of stereotypes, India has essentially created their own form of entertainment and they possibly want to be represented in that specific way. It's either that or they simply just want to see themselves beyond their stereotypes. They don't want to be portrayed as math wizards or market employees. They just want to be seen as normal human beings in society. That sounds like a basic solution, so what the fuck is preventing Hollywood from doing so? Either they don't want to embrace the cultures, as seen in whitewashing, or they rely on stereotypes because stereotypes sell. If we're trying to break all of these stereotypes in society, then we must get rid of them in pop culture. Of course, we can't completely ignore these stereotypes as they're important in history, but in the modern day when society has become more accepting of cultures, I think it's important to remember that accuracy is the key to establishing cultural appropriation and representation in pop culture.
Behold, cinema!
By the way, that music video of the song Tunuk Tunuk Tun was known for being the first Indian music video to use chroma key technology. So while it's a meme over here in the West, it holds pretty big cultural significance in India. That, and it's an absolute bop. You know, for a diverse community that Quentin is trying to depict, there are quite a lot of male characters in this story. The only female character's name is Princess?
Yeah, I don't see a problem with that.
Now, let me just say, I'm not trying to speak on behalf of females when talking about female representation in pop culture, and I am especially not trying to mansplain anything about feminism. I am simply just giving information based on my research and providing y'all with some of my personal opinions on the topic. Like, if feminism strives for equality between all genders, then shouldn't I, a man, have a fair say about this stuff? Because silencing men of their beliefs technically creates a hierarchy where females are better than men, which ultimately defeats the purpose of the concept of gender equality. So we good? Okay, yeah, let's continue. Anyways, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, our society was originally constructed to appeal to straight, white males. Let's go ahead and take a look at that male part. Now, of course, female representation goes all the way back in the earliest forms of pop culture. Specifically, I would like to tackle classical theater. When we think of classical theater, the first person that usually comes to mind is William fucking Shakespeare. Shakespeare was not only known for writing plays that would go on to be studied and adapted for centuries, but he was also responsible for popularizing some of today's most common story tropes. Forbidden love, questioning the concept of life and death. All these tropes were present multiple times throughout Shakespeare's work. Him writing these plays was essentially his way of exploring and potentially answering the questions that his society was too scared to ask. With this societal connection in mind, we can also see that some of his most popular characters reflected the common ideals of his time. Specifically, let's take a look at some of his female characters. Of course, you have his most popular female protagonist, Juliet from Romeo and Juliet. Juliet is basically the amalgamation of young innocence at the time, a virgin seeking for true love, which is something that a lot of us can relate to. Am I right, fellas? Now, this may seem like a typical love story at first, but the big twist is soon realized when we learn that her true love, Romeo, is derived from a conflict. We all know that first line. Two households, both alike in dignity. In fair Verona is where we lay our scene. Is wasn't in the original sentence, but you get my point. From that line alone, we immediately know shit's gonna be tragic. Ultimately, at the end of the play, we see Romeo finds Juliet's supposedly dead body. Heartbroken, Romeo drinks a bottle of poison and dies in the hopes of reuniting with his lover. But then Juliet wakes up and finds Romeo's lifeless body beside her. She too becomes heartbroken and with the stab of a dagger, kills herself. The forbidden lovers are united for eternity. Stories like Romeo and Juliet influence the modern-day romance tragedy, and considering the fact that both a male and a female character share the title of Shakespeare's most popular character, shows how anyone, regardless of gender identification, can play a significant role in defining both pop culture and society. But of course, there are various flaws with the character of Juliet. First of all, it's worth mentioning that in some of the original adaptations of Romeo and Juliet, Juliet was 13 years old while Romeo was in his early 20s. This of course was a reflection of how families at the time were trying to marry their daughters off as young as possible. Of course, nowadays, this is considered So, to better reflect with the times, most modern-day adaptations of Romeo and Juliet depict the couple with a 2-year age gap. Usually, Juliet is 20 and Romeo is 22. Another problem with Shakespeare's female characters is that they were not originally played by female performers. Hell, female performers didn't even exist at the time because the performing arts was one of the many jobs that women were supposedly not capable of doing. Like I said, this was a time when women were seen as vulnerable and elegant, so any job that didn't match those gender norms wasn't applicable to females. Oh yeah, that's another thing I want to bring up. It's that a majority of Shakespeare's female characters served as love interest for male protagonists. Other than Juliet, there is another character that I want to bring up, Beatrice from Much Ado About Nothing. The thing about Beatrice is that she's portrayed as a woman who wants to declare her own independence without having a man in her life. But at the end of the play, she ends up with the male protagonist, Benedict, which ultimately defeats her original intentions as a character. You're telling me that she didn't need a man but still ended up relying on a man to fulfill her needs by the end of the story? Calm the fuck down! So yeah, as you can see, pop culture hasn't always been entirely nice towards female representation in film. It had become so common to depict females in such a vulnerable states that it inevitably ended up being their only defining character traits or form of character development for years. From how I see it, these depictions led to the creation of two female stereotypes: the damsel in distress, aka the vulnerable and love-seeking female character who can't defend for herself, seen in Juliet, and fridging, which was originally a term used to explain the death of a female character to motivate a male character in a story. And although Beatrice didn't exactly die, she did kill and abandon most of her beliefs just so that she could be there for Benedict and his struggles. Unfortunately, these two specific stereotypes and character tropes were used as the basis for female characters for years. And because of that, gender norms were further established and practiced. Like, imagine all the young girls watching Romeo and Juliet back in the day, thinking that they'll one day find their Romeo, without realizing that there are way more valuable things that they can accomplish in their life. And even if they do realize that there is more to life than love, society and gender norms would always prevent them from seeking a bigger life. It wouldn't be until the rise of feminism and female empowerment throughout the 1920s and 90s when females would finally be given the chance to seek that bigger life. And on top of that, we would finally be able to see females depicted in pop culture roles that were traditionally meant for men. Much like how society was slowly starting to break gender norms, pop culture was starting to break the tropes and stereotypes of females that were created long ago. Ripley from the Alien franchise, a badass woman who fought the Xenomorph Queen with a fucking mech. Harley Quinn, Joker's former girlfriend who eventually broke up with him and started an independent crime life of her own. Princess Leia from Star Wars, the general of the Rebellion Alliance who showed that the galaxy is not limited to gender norms, except the time when she was sexualized and turned into Jabba the Hutt's slave for the sake of fan service. But she eventually choked the shit out of him. Not only did these character traits go beyond the female story tropes, but they even appealed to everyone regardless of gender. Like, seriously, growing up, the most influential female figures during my childhood were my mom and the Powerpuff Girls. If these characters don't reflect female empowerment, then I don't know what does. Now, unfortunately, the rise of heroines in pop culture led to the creation of a new character trope known as the Mary Sue. Originating from the fanfiction community, this term was used to define female characters whose only defining character trait was effortless power. The Mary Sue in a narrative is basically supposed to be stronger than any male character, with no explanation to their power and no weaknesses whatsoever. Here's an example of a Mary Sue, Rey Skywalker from the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Much like any other Jedi in Star Wars, Rey Skywalker has the Force, and it allows her to lift objects with her mind and finds inner peace. Now, in her first movie alone, not only was she able to immediately wield a lightsaber without any training whatsoever, but she was also able to lift objects and even mind control people on her first try. Let's compare that to Luke Skywalker in the original trilogy. Luke in his first movie only learned two things: how to wield a lightsaber and how to use the Force to find inner peace. And as the next movie in the trilogy clearly showed, he had a lot more to master when training with Yoda, and even after his trilogy was over, still had a lot to learn. That right there is a Mary Sue scenario. I'm not saying that females aren't capable of accomplishing things on the first try. I'm saying that if you're gonna portray female empowerment in pop culture, then maybe at least have character developments that can reflect what feminism stands for. The thing that people forget about feminism is that females weren't immediately given every opportunity from the get-go. First it was voting rights, and then a couple decades later it was working rights, and then a decade later they fought for equal pay. And even up until today, feminists around the world are still fighting for basic rights and necessities. This step-by-step evolution is what makes feminism such a powerful movement, and I believe this development should be represented in pop culture. People love Harley Quinn because we get to see her evolve and find her independence over time. It's what ultimately makes her a timeless heroine. So, much like how feminism took a long time to fully develop in our society, it's only a matter of time until we get to see female representation in pop culture in its fullest and most beautifully empowering form. Now that we've covered both people of color and female representation in film, I would like to take this second intermission to talk about statistics. I mean, it isn't a final project unless we got percentages, am I right? Now, another reason why communities continue to be misrepresented in pop culture is because sometimes these communities are not even recognized for their achievements in pop culture history. For example, let's take a look at 3 films that depict African American culture and history. You have the 2014 film Get On Up, starring Chadwick Boseman as the legendary James Brown. You have 2015 Straight Outta Compton, which told the story of the rap group NWA and how they revolutionized the rap music genre, which even had Ice Cube's son play as Ice Cube. And another 2015 film, Creed, starring Michael B. Jordan as the protege of Rocky Balboa. Why do I bring these films up, you may ask? Well, it's because all 3 of these films and their respective performances were all applicable for Best Actor nominations during the 2015 and 2016 Oscars. So, how is it that we have all of these amazing black performers, yet for those 2 years, all 20 acting nominations were given to white performers? Like, is this the Academy Awards or is this a Trump rally? This is a Trump rally, isn't it? Unfortunately, it isn't. Now, apparently, former Academy President Cheryl Boone Isaacs stated that this whiteness was also present within the Academy itself, as everyone who was responsible for choosing these nominations looked the same, which basically meant they were all white. These board members would then go on to say that they're simply professionals who vote for who's best. Now, of course, this whiteness within the Academy is what led some people to believe that there was some sort of racial bias in the Oscars, which completely understandable. So when people began to realize this, it eventually led to the creation of the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite, which basically turned into a movement that brought awareness to people of color in the film industry. Another variation of this hashtag #WhitewashedOut, brought awareness to the whitewashing of Asian narratives that I mentioned earlier in this video. Despite all of this, however, I believe that there is another factor that explains why people of color aren't really recognized in the film industry. It's because there weren't that many people of color in the industry to begin with. According to the New York Times, in 2015 alone, 86% of the top films featured white actors in lead roles. Through this perspective, I can kinda see why Straight Outta Compton didn't get any acting nominations. A majority of narratives that anyone could relate to at the time were white narratives, and Straight Outta Compton could only relate to rap fans and people of color, as well as an adult audience, since the film was rated R. That and the controversial themes of the film, such as gang violence and AIDS, could have potentially scared off casual audiences, which is why they went to see white narrative-driven stories instead, because they were more family-friendly. But then again, this could be contradicted by the fact that Creed released the same year. Creed not only appealed to the black community, but it also appealed to Rocky fans who wanted to see Sylvester Stallone portray the famous boxer again. So even when a movie appeals to all audiences, why weren't they nominated? Let's take a look at more statistics. Now, according to Variety.com, people of color made up 12.2% of the directors of theatrical films in 2011. This eventually boosted up to 19.3% by 2018, but then went down to only 14.4% in 2019. The significant jump between 2011 and 2018 made sense because, as I mentioned before, that was a time period when people of color were starting to become more expressive, and as a result, their history and narratives became more prevalent in pop culture. I questioned the sudden drop in 2019 at first, but then I remembered films such as Avengers Endgame, Joker, 1917, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood came out that exact year, all of which were directed by white filmmakers, so makes sense. Furthermore, in this chart from Medium.com, you can see that throughout the years 2007 to 2016, over 70% of characters on screen were white. For the late 2000s, I can understand, but for the 2010s, that was an era when cultural expression became more present in society than ever. Fucking Gangnam Style was released in 2012, and it brought Korean pop music to the Billboard charts. You're telling me that that same year, only 5% of characters on screen were Asian? Ultimately, however, through a social context, it comes to show how representation in pop culture doesn't always immediately reflect society. K-pop became popular in 2012, but Korean representation in pop culture didn't become relevant until years later. And now, look at Korean pop culture. BTS is one of the most popular K-pop boy bands in the world. Parasite, a Korean film, made Oscar history by becoming the first foreign film to win the Best Picture category in the Academy Awards' 90-year run, which, yeah, well-deserved. Literally go up to any film major, and they'll tell you like a 1-hour thesis about that film. And Squid Game just recently became one of Netflix's biggest shows. Now, this sort of Korean representation took time to develop in pop culture, much like how it took time for society to fully appreciate Korean culture. It's all about the timeliness and how much our society grows. Now, going back to discrimination in the film industry, the case of discrimination can also be made towards women in Hollywood. In the 2020 Oscars, all Best Director nominations were given to men, in which actress and presenter Issa Rae appropriately replied,
"Congratulations to those men. And finally..."
Oh, slay queen, slay. On the other hand though, according to Variety.com, the amount of female directors went up significantly between the years 2011 and 2019, going from 4.1% to a whopping 15.1%. Furthermore, lead female roles between those same years went from 25.6% to 44.1%. This can be attributed by the fact that female empowerment stories were slowly starting to make its way into film during that era. Hidden Figures, which told the story of the unsung scientist of NASA, was released in 2016. Wonder Woman released in 2017, and it finally adapted the story of one of pop culture's most significant heroines onto the big screen. As female narratives were on the rise, so did the presence of females in pop culture. And the fact that general audiences were cool with it shows how society has come to accept and recognize female contributions in history. All of these statistics show how expressive storytellers from different communities have become over time. And as a result, society became more willing to hear these stories. Wait, so you're playing as a gay character, but you yourself are straight.
Yeah, seems pretty straightforward to me.
You seriously don't see a problem in that? Dude, they could have easily given this to an actual gay actor. Like, what the fuck?
I mean, when you put it that way, yeah.
He even wears a pink flower bikini throughout the entire film. Like, are they trying to sexualize him?
I was not aware about the bikini part.
Bro, and look at this. The description of the gay character is quite literally 2 words. Comedic relief. Gay characters are more than a comedic relief. Man! Now, admittedly, when I first jumped into the topic of LGBT plus representation in pop culture, I was mostly focusing on the romances and relationships of these individuals on screen, because it was one of the most common ways the community was depicted. But a thing that people don't realize is that the history of the LGBT plus community goes beyond romances and sexuality. Much like any other oppressed group, the LGBT plus community has went through a history of protests and riots that fought against discrimination. Yet, not many people talk about these aspects of the community. Like, we have a lot of films that tell about the civil rights movement, but very rarely do I come across films about the 1969 Stonewall riots. That played an essential part during the gay rights movement, and I'm surprised we haven't seen it being represented in pop culture. Especially since LGBT plus representation has grown a lot throughout this past decade, I can't help but to wonder if modern day pop culture mediums will ever cover these events. Hell, it would be very timely as well if you think about it. One of the most important figures in the Stonewall Uprising was Marsha P. Johnson, a transgender female who fought for gay liberation and transgender rights. And now, here we are over 50 years later, and transgender individuals, especially the transgender youth, are still fighting for basic human rights because their lives are, once again, being put at risk because of our incompetency of our own political leaders. So, hey, why isn't Hollywood getting onto this? Wouldn't it make sense to bring awareness to LGBT plus rights and history during a time when the awareness of this community is heavily needed? Well, much like the troubled history of our society's harsh treatment towards LGBT plus individuals, pop culture has had a history of depicting LGBT plus individuals and narratives in a way that devalues their importance. The transgender community especially falls victim to misrepresentation in pop culture. For example, the 1959 film Some Like It Hot follows its 2 main characters, Joe and Jerry, as they decide to temporarily transition to females to hide from a mafia gang. That description alone already showcases a common problem that can be seen in other earlier depictions of the transgender community. That being the common misconception that transitioning is a temporary choice. Now, in the modern day, it's okay for individuals to use temporary pronouns whenever they're unsure about their gender identification. But in the case of Joe and Jerry, they're literally using their trans identities to their advantage. They just see these identities as a phase, and this of course can lead to many people thinking that transgender individuals are just experiencing a phase in their life. It's the reason why some stupid politicians think that transitioning is a disease that can be cured. But in reality, transgender individuals are making a life commitment, and they're truly identifying themselves for who they truly are. So to have people say that their choice is just a phase completely disrespects their individuality and violates their freedom of expression. Another misconception that was created as a result of this film was that transgender individuals use their identity to fulfill their perverted and sexual fantasies. In the film, Joe uses his privileged position as Josephine to learn about what women consider the perfect man. He then uses this newfound knowledge to attract and seduce Marilyn Monroe's character, Candy. So basically, the film is suggesting that trans women use their identity as a disguise so that they can take advantage of people's secrets. God damn it. This film infuriates me. Literally a majority of transgender stereotypes derived from this film, and it unfortunately gave transgender individuals a bad reputation in society. It's even worse when you come to realize that this is a comedy film. We are once again seeing a community of oppressed people being represented through such a comedic lens. Society is not taking transgender life seriously because they are seen in pop culture as one big joke. Sorry if I yell too much. It's the rights of transgender individuals just mean a lot to me. I have 2 friends who are transgender males, and they mean the world to me. So seeing how their community has struggled to find a name for themselves for so many years has been heartbreaking. Now, whenever we do see an accurate portrayal of transgender individuals in media, especially nowadays, it makes me happy to see them presented in such an uplifting and meaningful way. But I'm saddened knowing that society hasn't reflected that yet.
I wanna be a boy, or at least that's what I think this feeling is. Take red pen to my paper, correct mistakes, got somehow dead. I wanna befriend bugs, climb tall trees, scrape my knees, and show I am tough. Only cry in the nighttime, my bed is the thing I can trust. 'Cause I've grown sick of staring hours in the mirror, holding cheekbones, hoping if this could appear. I'll break and bend my spine if it make you say you're mine, you're mine, you're mine. I'll break and bend my spine if it make you say you're mine. Could it make you say you're mine? It's so unfair. I guess I wanna be a boy.
How seriously are we taking these LGBT plus love stories? Are we treating these narratives as actual love stories with character development and meaning? Or are we just including LGBT plus romance for the sake of diversity? This once again relates to how society perceives or should perceive LGBT plus couples. Love is love, and we must strive for a society that normalizes love regardless of preferences. One film in particular that I think portrays this serious message in a meaningful way is Brokeback Mountain. The film is about the romance between two country boys, Ennis and Jack. Throughout the film, the two argue a lot over whether or not their love for each other is real. These argument scenes end up breaking the stereotype of how gay couples were never taken seriously in the media, as it was one of the first major times in American pop culture where a gay couple was realistically portrayed with serious conflict. Furthermore, towards the end of the film, when Ennis is mourning the sudden loss of Jack, he gets a visit from his daughter and is told that she's getting married to her fiance. Ennis congratulates his daughter and suddenly reflects on his relationship with Jack. Much like how Ennis was accepting towards his daughter's marriage, he himself was finally accepting his love towards Jack. The ultimate testament to love is love. Now, obviously, Brokeback Mountain had its fair share of flaws as well. The movie's two main stars, Jake Gyllenhaal and Heath Ledger, rest in peace, were both straight, which of course led to the whole debate about straight washing and how straight actors are stealing roles that could have been given to gay actors. It's also important to note that a majority of the film focused on the sexual aspect of Jack and Ennis's relationship. This heavily sexualizes the LGBT plus community and gives the general audience a false idea that homosexual relationships are nothing but sex. To be fair though, this stereotype did exist way before Brokeback Mountain was released. For example, during the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, sexually transmitted diseases were being heavily associated with homosexual activity. However, scientists soon figured out that individuals could get STDs from any form of sexual activity, regardless of your partner. But since the misconception about homosexual sex had already been widespread, people just assumed that sex was the only thing that the LGBT plus community was known for. So I can see why LGBT plus couples are still being sexualized in pop culture up until today.
So wait, how should we represent LGBT plus couples in pop culture? I mean, if you don't want to sexualize them, then how else are you supposed to visually represent their love?
Emotions, physical affection such as hugging, normal couple shit, basically anything that doesn't involve fucking. The more we're able to disassociate the sexual stereotype and other gay stereotypes from the LGBT plus community, the more normalized they will become, both in society and in pop culture.
What about kissing? Is that considered sexual?
Well, kissing doesn't necessarily have to be a sexual thing. If anything, it's one of the most normal ways couples show affection towards each other on a daily basis. Some of the most significant and memorable moments in LGBT plus pop culture history involved kissing. Perhaps a kiss can ultimately normalize love. So, Rumi, do you think you learned a lot about representation and misrepresentation in pop culture?
I guess. I mean, the main message that I'm gathering from your whole video essay is that in order to have true representation in pop culture, you just have to tell it as is. if we want to get rid of stereotypes and story tropes that are based on troubled histories and social norms, then I'd say just tell it as is. You want to tell a good story? Then just tell about what you have seen. And that's the exact point that I'm trying to make about Quentin's script. He's quite literally trying to represent his community the best way he can because that's how he remembers it. So, look, dude, why don't you just take a look at the script one more time? I think it can reflect a lot of your ideas, honestly.
Huh. So you're still defending Quentin's script? I mean, I guess I can give it a second look. Wait a minute. I just realized. Holy shit. These aren't stereotypes. These are metaphors. I think I'm finally starting to get it. The use of the N-word in this story isn't supposed to be racist or offensive. It's just supposed to represent how the black community was able to take a derogatory term and turn it into a term that brought the community together.
Yes, now you're getting it.
Your gay character is wearing a flower bikini not because they're trying to sexualize him, but because they're trying to show how he bloomed and showed his true self. And the reason why the only female character is named Princess is because... Oh my god. She's a transgender drag queen. It all makes sense now. Princess was just her stage name. Oh.
Huh. I guess you're the one that learned something today.
You know what? I judged this script too harshly. I'm honestly glad that you get to be a part of this film, man. Here. Good luck, man.
Yeah, man, no worries. Don't be too hard on yourself. I know you're just trying to look out for others and be considerate towards other communities, but, you know, sometimes what we've already got is perfect as is. Of course, we can always strive for improvements, but honestly, I think we should just chill with the representation we have now. Change will come eventually. Like you yourself said, we just have to take our time and wait.
I appreciate you, Rumi.
My name's Daniel, by the way.
Okay, Rumi.
That's life. That's what all the people say. You're riding high in April, shot down in May. But I know I'm gonna change that tune. When I'm back on top in June. I said that's life. And as funny as it may seem, some people get their kicks stomping on a dream. But I don't let it get me down. 'Cause this fine old world, it keeps spinning around. I've been a puppet, a pauper, a pirate, a poet, a pawn and a king. I've been up and down and over and out. And I know one thing, each time I find myself flat on my face, I pick myself up and get back in the race. That's life. That's life. I tell you, I can't deny it. I thought of quitting, baby, but my heart just ain't gonna buy it. And if I didn't think it was worth one single try, I'd jump right on a big bird and then I'd fly. I've been a puppet, a pauper, a pirate, a poet, a pawn and a king. I've been up and down and over and out. And I know one thing, each time I find myself laying flat on my face, I just pick myself up and get back in the race. That's life, that's life, and I can't deny it. Many times I thought of cutting out, but my heart won't buy it. But if there's nothing shaking come this here July, I'm gonna roll myself up in a big ball